Mother-in-law shoved my 7-year-old daughter into a bookshelf because she scored higher than her grandson on a reading assessment. She assumed that being family meant being untouchable. She was wrong. I had a co-signed business loan, a paper trail, and a very good memory. This is where her story ends and mine begins. The drive home from my in-laws' house was only 11 minutes, but I know every single traffic light on that route now because I counted them. 4 red lights. I sat through all 4 without moving, even when they turned green. The car behind me honked at the third one, and I didn't care. I was looking at my daughter Poppy in the rearview mirror. She was 7. She had a scratch along her right forearm, and she was holding it against her stomach like it hurt to let it hang loose. She wasn't crying the way kids cry when they want something. She was crying the quiet way, the way that means something is already broken inside and the tears are just the overflow. I pulled over on Westfield Avenue, 2 blocks from the house, and turned around in my seat. "Show me your arm," I said. She held it out. The scratch ran from her elbow almost to her wrist, red and raised, the kind of mark you get when skin meets a sharp corner at speed. The corner of the oak bookshelf in my mother-in-law's living room. The one she was so proud of. Custom made. $800. She mentioned the price every single time we visited. "Grammy pushed me," Poppy said. Her voice was so matter-of-fact it scared me more than if she had been screaming. I know. I already knew. I had been in the kitchen doorway and I had seen it. I had seen Evelyn grab Poppy's shoulder. I had seen the look on her face. Not a loss of control. Not a stumble. But a deliberate turning. A pivot. And then the shelf, and then the sound of Poppy hitting it, and then the sound of Poppy's small body sliding to the floor. All because Poppy's reading level had just been assessed at the 3rd grade. She was in 1st grade. My nephew Colin, Evelyn's golden grandson, was in 2nd grade and reading at level. It was a number on a school form. That was all it was. And Evelyn had spent the last 40 minutes at the kitchen table explaining to my husband's sister what a shame it was that Colin was being held back by a classroom that had to accommodate children who were pushed too fast. Poppy had been sitting on the floor next to the coffee table, drawing in. Her sketch pad the way she always did at Grammy's house when the adults talked about things she wasn't supposed to understand. She understood. She always understood. She looked up at her grandmother, and she said, in her perfectly clear 7-year-old voice, "I worked really hard on my reading, Grammy. Mrs. Pearson said I can join the 3rd grade reading group on Thursdays." The room went still. Evelyn smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "That's sweet, sweetheart," she said. "Colin is working very hard too. He just has a different kind of smart." "I know," Poppy said simply, going back to her drawing. "He's good at soccer." She meant it as a compliment. She genuinely meant it as a compliment. She was 7. She was trying. Evelyn's face did something I had seen it do before, privately, in small flashes. A tightening around the jaw, a flattening of the eyes. She stood up from the couch and walked toward the bookshelf, saying something about getting a photo album, and she was right next to Poppy. And then her hand was on Poppy's shoulder, and Poppy was stumbling sideways, and the bookshelf was there. I crossed the kitchen in 2 steps. By the time I reached Poppy, Evelyn was already crouching over her, her voice all soft concern. "Oh, sweetheart, you tripped. Let Grammy see." And she reached for Poppy's arm, and Poppy flinched away from her hand. That flinch. That was the thing that I will never forget. My daughter flinched away from her grandmother's touch, like she already knew, even at 7, that the touch wasn't safe. I got between them. I picked Poppy up. I said, "We're leaving," and I walked out of that living room without looking at my husband's mother again. My husband Theo was in the backyard with his brother when I came through the sliding glass door with Poppy on my hip. "We have to go," I said. He looked up from whatever they were talking about. He read something in my face. "What happened?" I didn't answer until we were in the car and Poppy had her headphones in, watching something on my phone, the volume up. Then I told him what I had seen. Theo was quiet for a long time. "She might have just," he started. "She pushed her into a bookshelf, Theo. Mom's been stressed. The thing with Colin's school. I turned to look at him. There is no version of that sentence that ends in a way that makes this okay. He didn't say anything else. He drove. I looked out the window and I thought about the fact that Evelyn had been doing smaller versions of this for 2 years, since the moment it became clear that Poppy was academically ahead of Colin. Not physical, not before tonight, but the comments that landed like small, cold stones. The birthday parties where Colin's accomplishments were announced and Poppy's were quietly redirected. The Christmas where Evelyn gave Colin a telescope and gave Poppy a coloring book. Poppy was 5 and said, "Some kids just need more imaginative play." The Thanksgiving where she told my own mother, loud enough for me to hear, that she worried Poppy was being hothoused and that it wasn't healthy for a child's social development. I had swallowed all of it. I had swallowed it because Theo loved his mother and because I believed in keeping the peace, and because I told myself Poppy was fine, she was resilient, she didn't understand, she understood. She always understood. She always understood. I pulled out my phone while Theo drove. I opened the Notes app and I started writing down everything I had seen, time-stamped. The exact words Poppy had said. The exact words Evelyn had said. The direction of the movement. The placement of the shelf. The sound of impact. I wrote it like a report because I was thinking clearly, more clearly than I had thought in 2 years, and I knew I would need every single detail. I texted my sister, who is a pediatric physical therapist and mandatory reporter in the state of Ohio. I said, "Something happened tonight. I need to talk to you tomorrow. It's about Poppy." She called me in 4 minutes. The next morning I took Poppy to her pediatrician. I didn't take her to the practice where our whole family went, the one where Evelyn had personally recommended Dr. Hammond, and where I always felt vaguely watched. I took her to a walk-in pediatric clinic across town. I told the intake nurse my daughter was shoved into a piece of furniture by an adult. I want it documented. The doctor, a woman named Dr. Ose, who wore bright green clogs and spoke to Poppy directly and not over her head, examined the scratch and the bruising that had developed overnight along Poppy's shoulder blade. "Did it hurt when it happened?" Dr. Ose asked Poppy. "Yeah," Poppy said, "and it scared me." "What scared you?" Poppy thought about it. Grammy's face. Dr. Ose made a note. She looked at me. "I'm going to photograph this for the file. And because of the nature of the injury and how it was described, I'm obligated to make a report to Children's Services. Not because you're in trouble. You're not. But because the law requires it when a child presents with an injury caused by an adult." "I know," I said. "Document everything. I want a copy of the records today." What I didn't tell Dr. O.C., because it wasn't her concern, was the other reason I was thinking about documentation. The reason that had kept me awake until 2 in the morning. Evelyn's name was on a loan. Specifically, my name and Evelyn's name were on a $95,000 small business administration loan that her son, my husband, had taken out 3 years ago to open a custom furniture restoration shop. Theo's business? The business that was doing reasonably well now but had needed a cosigner when it launched because Theo's credit history was thin from 2 years of freelancing. I had agreed to cosign. So had Evelyn, because Theo had asked her, and she had wanted to be involved in her son's success story. Both our names sat on that loan document. Both our credit scores were tied to every payment. I had been the quiet cosigner for 3 years. Evelyn had been the loud one, the one who came to the shop opening and stood in the photos and told everyone at family dinners that she had helped make it possible. Last year, Theo had asked if I would consider refinancing, removing my name, replacing it with Evelyn's alone, because he wanted to expand and needed to pull a line of credit, and it would be cleaner if the cosigner structure was simplified. I had said I'd think about it. I had not yet signed anything. At 2 in the morning, I'd pulled out the folder where I kept our financial documents. I read the cosigner agreement. I read the SBA loan terms. I read the section on cosigner rights and obligations. I did not call my financial advisor. I called my friend Renata, who had been a commercial loan officer for 9 years before she transitioned to financial consulting. I texted her at 7 in the morning. I said, "I need 20 minutes of your time today. It's important." She called me on her lunch break. "Tell me exactly what you're thinking," she said. after I laid out the situation. I want to understand what happens if I formally notify the lender that I intend to withdraw my co-signature at the next refinance opportunity, and what that does to the existing loan structure. Renata was quiet for a moment. You can't unilaterally remove yourself from an existing co-signed loan without the lender's consent and a refinance. But you can absolutely refuse to extend your co-signature if he tries to refinance or restructure. You can also notify the lender of your intent not to renew. That flags the file. And what does that mean for the expansion he's trying to do? Without a clean cosigner arrangement, the expansion credit line gets complicated. Banks get cautious. It doesn't kill the business, but it puts the brakes on. I see. Can I ask what happened? I told her. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Okay, she said finally. I'd also talked to a family law attorney. Not because you're heading for divorce necessarily, but because you need to understand your position. I had an appointment with an attorney named Mr. Sear Carver by 4 o'clock the next afternoon. She specialized in family financial disputes, and she had the kind of measured, precise voice that made me feel like the ground under my feet was solid. I didn't tell Theo where I was going. I told him I had an errand. He was at the shop. He had been at the shop every day since the incident, arriving earlier than usual, staying later. I recognized that pattern. He was avoiding the conversation. Ms. Carver listened to everything. She looked at the copies I had brought, the loan document, the lease on the shop building, the business registration, the medical records from Dr. Osei, the time-stamped notes from my phone. You've been thorough, she said. I'm a data analyst, I said. It's a reflex. She explained my options clearly. The co-signature situation gave me meaningful leverage because the expansion Theo was planning required either my continued cooperation or a clean refinance. And getting a clean refinance on a business that was profitable but only 3 years old without an existing co-signer was going to be a difficult conversation with any lender. I'm not trying to hurt his business, I said. I want to be clear about that. What are you trying to do? She asked. I'm trying to make sure my daughter is never in that house again without consequences for the person who hurt her. And I'm trying to make sure my husband understands that his silence is a choice. Ms. Carver nodded slowly. Then the first thing you do is nothing dramatic. You document. You wait for Evelyn to make her next move because she will. And in the meantime, you have a direct, honest conversation with your husband about where you stand. I had that conversation the night Poppy went to sleep. I sat across from Theo at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where I had told him about the incident, where he had tried to explain his mother, and I told him everything. The attorney, the financial review, the loan. He stared at me. You went to a lawyer? My daughter has a bruise on her shoulder blade, Theo. I know that. But going to a lawyer feels like what? He struggled. Like you're going to war. I didn't start a war, I said. I'm just finally dressed for one. He was quiet for a long time. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he was genuinely processing something, not just deflecting. What do you want? He asked. I want your mother to never be alone with Poppy again. I want you to tell her that directly, not suggest it or imply it. And I want you to stop defending her instinct to compete with a 7-year-old. I don't defend, you said she might have just. You started to say that to me in the car with our daughter sitting 3 feet away. He closed his eyes. You're right. I know you're right. I also need you to understand that if she faces no consequences from this family, she will do something worse next time. That's not a prediction. That's a pattern. He didn't argue. He sat there and he looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. The kind of tired that comes from holding something heavy for too long without admitting it weighs anything. The next morning, he called his mother. I didn't listen in. I took Poppy to the park and we fed the ducks, and she asked me if Grammy was in trouble, and I said yes, a little bit, because she had made a bad choice. Poppy accepted that with the equanimity of someone who had already processed it privately and moved on. She fed a piece of bread to the ducks. She told me their names. She had named them all at some point. I just hadn't known. When we got home, Theo was sitting on the back steps. "She says you're exaggerating," he said without looking up. "She says Poppy tripped. She says you've always had it out for her because you think our side of the family isn't educated enough." I sat down next to him. "What did you say?" "I said she shoved a 7-year-old into a bookshelf because the 7-year-old read well. And?" She hung up on me. Then came the calls. Not to me. Evelyn was too savvy to call me directly now that things had gotten formal. She called Theo's aunt. She called Theo's older sister. She posted something vague on Facebook about family members who weaponize children and use money to control people, and her church friends filled the comments with supportive fire emojis. She told Theo's aunt that I had always been jealous of her relationship with Theo, that I'd never really accepted her, that the whole thing with Poppy was a setup. The aunt called me. "Honey, I know you're upset, but Evelyn is." "I have the medical report and the photos," I said. "I'm happy to forward them to you." Silence. "She's going through a hard time," the aunt said, quieter now. "I understand that. And my daughter has a documented injury caused by her grandmother. Both of those things are true at the same time." The aunt did not call back. 2 weeks after the incident, the Children's Services follow-up visit happened. It was a home visit. A caseworker named Mr. Torres came to our house, spoke with Poppy in the presence of myself and a child advocate, and reviewed the documentation. Poppy told him what had happened in the same flat, matter-of-fact voice she had used with me in the car. She said Grammy pushed her. She said she fell into the shelf. She said it hurt, and it scared her. Mr. Torres visited Evelyn separately. I wasn't there, but Theo was, because his mother had asked him to come. He told me afterward that she had cried, that she had told Mr. Torres it was an accident, that she had called Poppy very sensitive, and implied that Poppy had a tendency toward dramatization. I emailed Mr. Torres the next morning and attached the note I had taken on my phone the night of the incident, time-stamped, with the precise language Evelyn had used before the shove and the description of the physical movement I had witnessed. I also attached Dr. Osei's report, which used the language "injury consistent with contact with a hard-edged surface," and described by child as resulting from adult-initiated physical contact. Mr. Torres filed the case as substantiated neglect with a physical component. Evelyn's name went into the state registry. She found out 3 days later. She called Theo at 9 at night, screaming. I was in the other room and I could hear her voice through the phone from across the room, high and cracking. The same tone her face had made that night before she turned Poppy into the shelf. She used the word vindictive 4 times. She said I had destroyed her reputation. She said she was going to sue me for defamation. Theo held the phone away from his ear and looked at it, and then he said quietly, "Mom, stop." She didn't stop. He said, "I was there. I saw Poppy's arm. I saw her flinch when you tried to touch her after. I didn't say anything in the moment and I should have. But I'm saying it now. You hurt her." Evelyn screamed something I couldn't make out. "I'm hanging up now," Theo said. And he did. He sat down on the couch and put his face in his hands, and I let him sit there because I understood what it costs to finally stop protecting someone you love from the truth of who they are. The refinancing conversation happened 6 weeks later. Theo came to me with the paperwork from the bank. His expansion plan, a second workshop location in the Glenwood district, required a structured line of credit, and the cleanest path required revisiting the co-signature arrangement. I sat down with the paperwork. I had already spoken to Renata twice more and once more to Ms. Carver. "I'm not going to sign over sole co-signature to your mother," I said. Theo set down his coffee cup. "I know this isn't about the money," he said carefully. "It's not," I agreed. "But it's also not unrelated to everything else. I am not going to make her feel financially supported by this family while she is fighting the documentation of what she did to our daughter. So what does that mean for the expansion? It means you find a different cosigner, or you restructure without one, or you wait until the credit history is strong enough to stand alone. Renata has 3 suggestions for paths that don't involve me or your mother." Theo looked at the paperwork for a long time. "She's going to say you held this over me," he said. "She can say whatever she wants," I said. She said Poppy was dramatizing a deliberate shove. Her narrative stopped mattering to me. He nodded slowly. He gathered up the papers. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who was grieving something. The version of his family he had believed in, maybe. The version where everyone's motives were simple and everything could be smoothed over with enough goodwill. I understood that grief. I had felt it too, 2 years ago when I first started noticing the way Evelyn's eyes tracked Poppy at family events, measuring her against Colin, calculating. I had grieved the uncomplicated relationship I had hoped we would have. Then I had swallowed the grief and swallowed the comments and waited for things to get better. They hadn't gotten better. They had ended with my daughter on the floor next to an $800 bookshelf. Theo found a different co-signer, a business partner he had worked with for years who was willing to review the books and formalize his involvement. The expansion moved forward on a slower timeline. The second workshop opened 14 months later, not 6. Evelyn was not at the opening. The criminal matter took several more months. Evelyn's attorney, she hired a private one, not a public defender, argued that the incident was a misunderstanding, that no reasonable jury would characterize a grandmother's reaction to a rowdy child as assault. The DA's office, working from Dr. Osei's records, the CPS file, and Theo's own statement, which he gave voluntarily and which was, I learned later, devastating in its precision, declined to prosecute on felony grounds but did issue a formal diversion agreement. Evelyn was required to complete a family violence intervention program, 12 sessions, and have no unsupervised contact with Poppy for the duration of the program and its follow-up period. She told Theo's aunt it was all my fault. The aunt, to her credit, had by that point looked at the photos I had forwarded and had quietly stopped returning Evelyn's calls. Colin, my nephew, was caught in the middle of all of this in a way that kept me up at night. He was an innocent kid. He was sweet and he loved dinosaurs and he was not responsible for his grandmother's pathology. I made sure Poppy understood that. We still saw Colin at his father's house. Theo's brother was navigating his own complicated feelings about his mother and was doing his best. And Poppy and Colin got along fine, the way they always had when the adults were keeping score. The last time I saw Evelyn was in a parking lot outside a grocery store about 8 months after the intervention program ended. She was loading bags into her trunk. She saw me. We looked at each other across 15 feet of asphalt. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, she was the same height, the same build. But something in the way she held herself had changed. The certainty was gone. I didn't speak to her. I put my groceries in my car and I drove home. Poppy was at the kitchen table when I got back, doing her homework. 3rd grade now. She was working through a chapter book on her own, stopping occasionally to write a sentence in a little notebook she kept for words she wanted to remember. I had found it once by accident. She'd left it on the counter, and I had looked at the list. Persevere, reluctant, consequence, triumphant, words she'd found in books and wanted to keep. I made dinner and we ate, and she told me about the chapter she'd read, and I listened. And later when she was in bed and the house was quiet, I sat in the kitchen and I thought about all the times I had swallowed something I should have said. All the cold little stones I had let pile up. I thought about the night on Westfield Avenue with 4 red lights, my daughter in the rearview mirror with her arm held carefully against her stomach. I thought, the only person who still looks small in parking lots was the woman who had decided that a child's achievement was a personal attack. Poppy had no bruises anymore. She had a notebook full of words she wanted to keep. That was the whole story when I boiled it down to what actually mattered. My daughter flinched, and I stopped letting it slide, and everything that came after that was just the price of that decision, paid by the person who should have paid it all along. I keep thinking about Poppy's notebook, the one she left on the counter that I wasn't supposed to see, the list of words she collected from books she read on her own. Persevere. Reluctant. Consequence. Triumphant. She was 7 years old and she was quietly building a vocabulary for experiences she hadn't had yet. Or maybe she already had them. Maybe she understood more than I gave her credit for, and she was finding the words for it the only way she knew how. That's the part that sits with me the longest. Not the shelf, not the caseworker's visit, not the lone papers on the kitchen table. It's the notebook. Because what Evelyn tried to punish wasn't a test score or a reading level. It was exactly that quality in Poppy, the quiet, persistent, self-directed way she moved through the world. The ability to sit in a room full of noise and still find something worth knowing. That's not a thing you can beat out of a kid. You can scare them for a while. You can make them flinch, but you can't take away what's already grown in. I think about the choices I made in the weeks after it happened, and I don't think of them as revenge. I think of them as alignment. The things I did, the documentation, the attorney, the loan decision, those weren't punishments I designed. They were just what happens when you stop absorbing consequences that belong to someone else. Evelyn had been making choices for years. The comments at Christmas, the birthday party comparisons, the look on her face before she turned my daughter into that shell. Each one of those was a small decision. They compounded. That's how it always works. The consequences weren't something I invented. They were just the shape her own choices made when they finally ran out of room. Theo had his own reckoning in all of this. I watched him go through it. He's a good man, who spent years choosing comfort over honesty. And I don't say that to be hard on him. I did the same thing for 2 years, swallowing cold stones and calling it grace. But there's a difference between patience and complicity, and we had both been standing on the wrong side of that line without fully admitting it. The courage it took for him to say, clearly, in front of a caseworker and then again to his mother directly. I saw the bruise. I should have said something sooner. That mattered. It cost him something real. That's what integrity actually looks like in practice. Not grand gestures, just saying the true thing when it's hard and late and you'd rather not. And Poppy, she healed faster than I expected and slower than I hoped. The way kids do. She stopped flinching when adults touched her shoulder. She started her 3rd grade reading group on Thursdays. She kept the notebook. I think what carried her through wasn't anything I did in any courtroom or attorney's office. It was the things she already had inside her. The stubbornness to keep learning, to keep naming things, to keep going back to books even after someone tried to make her feel wrong for loving them. That's a kind of strength that doesn't come from being protected. It comes from being believed. I told her she did nothing wrong. I told her the truth about what happened. I didn't soften it into something easier to carry. I think that mattered more than anything else. I used to think keeping the peace was a form of love. I know now it's only love if the peace is real. The quiet we had before all of this wasn't peace. It was postponement. And the cost of postponement, when it finally comes due, is always paid by whoever was least able to protect themselves. Poppy was 7. She had a notebook full of words she wanted to keep. That was enough to fight for.